Picture this: a lone figure moves through a moonlit forest, their steps silent over damp moss and fallen leaves. The only light comes from a sliver of silver above, casting long shadows between ancient oaks. This isn't a wanderer lost in the woods, this is a healer, gathering nightshade and wolfsbane under the cover of darkness, knowing full well that such herbs could mean the difference between life and death, or between freedom and a fiery end. In the Middle Ages, the line between healer and heretic was terrifyingly thin, and the knowledge these men and women carried was both a profound gift and a deadly burden. Their practices, steeped in ancient wisdom, whispered incantations, and dangerous experimentation, existed in the shadows, feared by the church, sought by the desperate, and remembered today only in fragments of forbidden history. This was a world where medicine mingled with magic, where science brushed up against superstition, and where the desire to heal could just as easily lead to salvation as to the stake. What drove these individuals to risk everything? What secrets did they guard? And why were their methods considered so threatening to the powers that ruled medieval Europe? We're about to step into their world, a place of mystery, courage, and unthinkable choices. This is the story of the forbidden practices of medieval healers, and it's a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about medicine, magic, and the price of knowledge in an age of fear. From hidden manuscripts to covert rituals performed far from judging eyes, these healers operated in a realm where every cure came with a cost, and every patient posed a potential risk. They were botanists, chemists, and spiritual guides all at once, often women, often outsiders whose understanding of the natural world was decades, even centuries ahead of their time. Yet for their innovation, they faced suspicion, persecution, and worse. As we unravel their methods, their motivations, and the myths that still surround them, you'll begin to see these figures not as witches or monsters, but as pioneers trapped in a society that couldn't or wouldn't understand their gifts. You'll discover how they diagnosed illness without modern tools, how they blended prayer with potion, and why some treatments we might dismiss as superstition actually held startling scientific insight. This isn't just a history lesson, it's an immersion into a hidden chapter of human resilience and curiosity. So settle in, open your mind, and allow yourself to journey back to a time when healing was an act of rebellion, and knowledge was the most dangerous magic of all. To understand their world, we must first step into the village square and see them not as we imagine them now, but as their neighbors did. The medieval healer was a figure of profound contradiction, a walking paradox of trust and terror. For the vast majority of people, the peasants, farmers, and common folk, this individual was often the only barrier between their family and a painful, untimely death. They were the first and last resort, the keeper of recipes for poultices that could draw out infection, the possessor of knowledge on which herbs could ease a fever or soothe a difficult childbirth. In a time without hospitals or licensed physicians for anyone but the very wealthy, the local healer was a vital, indispensable thread in the fabric of the community. Their training was almost never formal in the way we think of it. There were no universities for these village practitioners. Instead, knowledge was passed down through generations, often from mother to daughter, or from a master to an apprentice through careful, hands-on instruction. This was an oral tradition, a living library of plant lore, bone-setting techniques, and diagnostic intuition built over a lifetime of observation. A healer learned which mushrooms could kill and which could cure by remembering the subtle differences in the gills and the stems. They understood the cycles of the moon and the seasons, knowing when to harvest roots for maximum potency. This was applied science, refined through trial and error and guarded as a precious family secret. Yet, this very knowledge that made them so essential also made them dangerously suspect. In the eyes of the Church, which held immense power over every aspect of life, any practice that fell outside its strict doctrine was a threat. If a healer used a charm or an incantation alongside a herbal remedy, was she channeling divine aid or demonic power? If her cure worked where a priest's prayers had failed, did that mean her alliance was with something darker? The Church framed the world as a battle between God and the devil, and anyone operating in the ambiguous space between, especially with such potent, unexplained results, was easily cast as an agent of the enemy. This suspicion was often amplified by the sheer unpredictability of life. If a healer's patient recovered, she was a blessing. But if the patient took a turn for the worse and died, that failure could quickly be reinterpreted as malice, a curse disguised as aid. This precarious position was intensely shaped by gender. While there were male healers, the practice was overwhelmingly associated with women. This was in many ways a natural extension of the domestic roles women were expected to fulfill, caring for the sick, attending births, and managing the household's health. Older women, in particular, post-menopausal and no longer fulfilling a traditional childbearing role, often found a unique form of authority and purpose in their healing work. But in a deeply patriarchal society, this also made them vulnerable. A woman with specialized knowledge, operating with a degree of independence outside the direct control of men, was a disruption to the established social order. Her authority came not from an institution like the church or a guild, but from her own skill and the trust of her community, a power that those in formal positions of authority viewed as unpredictable and therefore threatening. So the healer existed in a constant state of conditional acceptance. She was respected out of necessity, but that respect could evaporate in an instant. A bad harvest, an outbreak of plague, a stillborn child, any community tragedy needed a scapegoat, and the solitary woman with her mysterious herbs and unconventional wisdom was an easy target. She was simultaneously relied upon and feared, called upon in the dead of night, yet potentially denounced in the public square by daylight. Her status was never secure, a constant negotiation between the gratitude of those she helped and the pervasive fear of the unknown that defined the medieval mindset. She walked a tightrope where her greatest strength, her knowledge, was also her most profound liability. But to truly grasp the danger these healers faced, we must look beyond the village and toward the towering spires of the church. For the medieval Catholic Church, the human body was not merely a physical vessel. It was a sacred reflection of the divine order, and its ailments were deeply spiritual matters. Sickness was widely interpreted as a manifestation of sin, a divine punishment, or a test of faith. Therefore, the act of healing was by its very nature a theological event. This perspective granted the Church ultimate authority over medicine, creating a rigid framework where any practice outside its control wasn't just alternative, it was apostasy. The Church's campaign to monopolize healing was both ideological and intensely practical. From around the 12th century, it began to systematically promote the idea that only prayers, pilgrimages to holy relics, and interventions by sanctioned priests constituted legitimate cures. These methods reinforced church doctrine, channeled desperate people toward its institutions, and offered a spiritual explanation for both recovery and death. A recovery was a miracle, a sign of God's grace earned through piety. A death was God's will, a call to greater faith. This system provided comfort and order, but it left little room for the empirical, earth-based methods of the local healer. This is where the theological lines blurred into deadly accusation. The Church constructed a powerful binary. Anything not explicitly of God must, by definition, be of the devil. A healer's success, when it surpassed the results of prayer alone, became suspect evidence of a demonic pact. The herbs themselves were neutral, but the intent and the method were everything. If a woman used a complex herbal poultice while murmuring an old chant passed down from her grandmother, church authorities could easily reinterpret that chant as an invocation of evil spirits. Her deep knowledge of plant cycles could be twisted into a sign of consorting with dark forces that governed nature. The very fact that her knowledge was oral and secret, rather than written and approved by clerical scholars, branded it as forbidden lore. Specific theological arguments were weaponized to draw this distinction. Godly healing was public, involved prayers to Christ and the saints, and always acknowledged that the Church was the ultimate conduit of God's power. The sanctioned healer, often a monk or priest, acted as a humble intermediary. Demonic healing, in the Church's view, was private and secretive. It relied on the healer's own claimed power or on agreements with unseen entities, thereby bypassing the Church's authority and risking the patient's soul for the sake of their body. The greatest sin of the village healer was not her use of nightshade, but her assertion of a personal, autonomous power that challenged the Church's monopoly on salvation. This fear was crystallized in the concept of the maleficum, the evil deed. A healer could be accused of maleficum not for failing to cure, but for curing too well, or for a cure that was followed by an unrelated misfortune. If a healer treated a farmer's child who then recovered, but the farmer's cow sickened and died the next week, the healer could be blamed for both events: the successful cure proof of her power and the cow's death proof of her malicious will. This paradoxical logic made her position impossible. Her skills made her indispensable, but those same skills painted a target on her back, waiting for the right moment of community panic or clerical scrutiny to turn suspicion into a charge of witchcraft. The Church didn't just fear her medicine, it feared her independence. Herbalism was the very bedrock of the healer's craft, a living science built not in laboratories but in forest clearings and cottage gardens. It was a practice of profound observation where every leaf, root, and flower held a potential key to unlocking the body's ailments. At the heart of this knowledge, one guiding principle offered an intuitive map for navigating the vast and often dangerous world of plants: the doctrine of signatures. This was the belief that God, or nature itself, had marked each healing herb with a clear sign, a physical clue that revealed its purpose to those who knew how to look. A plant's shape, color, or texture was a divine instruction manual. The lungwort plant, for instance, with its leaves speckled and shaped like a human lung, was therefore the obvious choice for treating consumption and asthma. The bumpy, brain-like kernel inside a walnut shell signaled its use for head ailments and mental confusion. The vibrant red sap of the bloodroot plant clearly indicated it was meant for wounds and blood disorders. For a healer without formal medical texts, this doctrine was a powerful and logical system, turning the entire natural world into a coded pharmacopoeia waiting to be deciphered. This intuitive system dictated a vast portion of their daily practice. Beyond the well-known examples, countless other signatures guided their hands. The hollow stalks of plants like garlic and angelica were seen as conduits for clearing blocked airways. Eyebright, a small flower with a dark spot that resembles a pupil, was used for infections and tired eyes. Even the environment where a plant grew offered clues. Those thriving in damp, boggy areas were often prescribed for illnesses involving fluid retention or sluggishness, following the logic that like treats like. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a framework for empirical testing. A healer would observe the signature, prepare the herb, and note its effects on a patient. Over generations, this built a robust, albeit unofficial, body of evidence. Some of these applications, we now know, were remarkably effective due to genuine chemical properties. Lungwort, for instance, contains compounds that are mucilaginous and soothing to irritated membranes. Willow bark, whose tall, fever-racked appearance might suggest its use, contains salicin, the natural precursor to aspirin. Yet, this very effectiveness was the healer's greatest peril. The doctrine of signatures, while deeply intuitive, was also deeply mystical. It relied on a worldview where the physical and spiritual realms were completely intertwined, where a plant's appearance was a message from the divine. When a healer successfully used a yellow flower like celandine to treat jaundice, which yellows the skin, her success could be interpreted in two wildly different ways. To her and her patients, it was proof of a benevolent natural order. To a suspicious priest or a fearful neighbor, it looked like magic. The healer wasn't just applying a remedy, she was seemingly interpreting God's hidden language, an act that the church argued was the sole purview of its own ordained interpreters. Her ability to read these signs could be twisted into evidence of consorting with the very forces that created those signs, placing her in direct competition with divine authority. Furthermore, the preparation of these herbs often involved rituals that sealed their fate in the eyes of the accuser. A healer might harvest a root at a specific phase of the moon, or recite a traditional rhyme while cutting the plant, or use tools that had been passed down for generations. These actions were about tradition, respect, and timing for optimal potency, but from the outside they looked indistinguishable from sorcery. The line between a prayer for God to bless the herb and an incantation to activate its power was invisible to anyone determined to see evil. If a poultice made from signature herbs worked with startling speed where prayers had failed, it didn't prove the healer's skill. It suggested her power came from a different, darker source. The Doctrine of Signatures, a system meant to demystify the natural world for these practitioners, ultimately became one of the primary reasons they were condemned. Their deep literacy in nature's language became the very evidence used to silence them, proving that in an age of fear, even the most intuitive science could be branded as a forbidden pact. Of all the plants in the healer's forbidden garden, none was more shrouded in potent mystery and outright terror than the mandrake root. This was not a simple herb for poultices or teas. It was a substance of legend, a living paradox that promised miraculous healing and threatened unthinkable danger in equal measure. With its thick, often disturbingly humanoid root system, frequently forked into leg-like shapes or bearing protrusions that resembled arms and a head, the mandrake seemed to embody the very essence of nature's uncanny power. It occupied a space between plant and person, a creature of the earth that blurred the line between the natural world and the supernatural, making it the ultimate symbol of the healer's ambiguous craft. Its uses were as powerful as its appearance was bizarre. Healers prized mandrake primarily as an incredibly potent anesthetic and hallucinogen. A tiny sliver of the root, carefully prepared and administered, could plunge a patient into a deep, death-like sleep, allowing for the painless setting of broken bones or even rudimentary surgical procedures like amputations. It was a key ingredient in early soporific sponges, where the juice would be soaked into a sponge and held under the patient's nose to induce unconsciousness. In smaller doses, it was used as a sedative to treat anxiety, insomnia, and intense pain. But the line between medicine and poison was razor-thin. The active compounds in mandrake, such as scopolamine and atropine, are powerful tropane alkaloids. A miscalculation of the dose by even a fraction could easily tip a patient from a healing sleep into a coma or stop their heart entirely. The healer who wielded mandrake was playing with life and death itself, an act that required not just knowledge but immense courage and a steady hand. This inherent danger was magnified 1,000-fold by the elaborate and superstitious rituals that surrounded its harvest. It was widely believed that the mandrake root did not give up its power willingly. The most pervasive legend held that when pulled from the ground, the root would emit a blood-curdling scream, a shriek so horrifying it could kill anyone who heard it or drive them irrevocably insane. This belief was not mere folklore, it was a practical warning born from the plant's very real toxicity. The procedures for safely harvesting it read like a page from a grimoire. The recommended method involved tracing 3 circles around the base of the plant with a sword of iron to contain its power, then turning one's back to it. The harvester would tie a hungry dog to the root and then retreat to a safe distance, offering a piece of meat just out of the animal's reach. The dog, straining for the food, would wrench the root from the earth and succumb to its lethal scream, sacrificing itself so the healer could then retrieve the root in safety. This ritual underscores the profound respect and sheer fear these practitioners had for the forces they manipulated. It was a physical acknowledgement that extracting this knowledge from nature came at a terrible cost. To the medieval church, these rituals were not just superstition, they were undeniable proof of demonic communion. Every aspect of the mandrake's lore confirmed their deepest fears. Its human-like form was seen as a perversion of God's image, a demonic mimicry created to mock humanity. The belief that it screamed was interpreted not as a metaphorical warning, but as literal evidence that a malicious spirit was trapped within the plant. The complex ceremonial harvest involving iron, circles, and animal sacrifice mirrored the very kinds of occult rituals the church condemned. Why would a God-fearing person need such elaborate pagan precautions if the power they were accessing was divine? The answer from the clerical perspective was obvious: they wouldn't. The healer who used mandrake was therefore not a physician but a necromancer, consorting with imprisoned demons and harnessing their unclean power to perform false miracles. The plant's dual nature as both medicine and poison perfectly served the church's argument. Its healing properties were a demonic lure, a trick to ensnare souls, while its deadly potential revealed its true, malicious purpose. In the mandrake root, the church found the perfect symbol for everything it feared about forbidden knowledge, a power that worked but at the damnable cost of the user's very soul. Beyond the realm of powerful plants lay an even more controversial frontier of healing, one that drew not from the soil but from the animal kingdom. The medieval healer's pharmacopoeia was startlingly holistic, and it included a vast array of remedies derived from creatures of every kind. Dried and powdered toad was a common application for infections and buboes, its cold, warty skin seen as a counteragent to the heat of swelling and fever. Amulets crafted from the teeth of wolves or the bones of hares were worn to transfer the animal's strength or speed to the ailing wearer. Even the humble earthworm rendered into an oil was a prescribed salve for aches and pains. To our modern sensibilities, these cures might seem like the height of superstition, but for the medieval practitioner, they were applications of a coherent, albeit complex, system of thought known as sympathetic magic. This worldview operated on a fundamental principle that like attracts like, and that symbolic connections between objects could influence reality. An animal's physical characteristics or behaviors were not random, they were a visible language of its inherent virtues. A toad, which could survive in damp, foul conditions without succumbing to illness, must therefore possess a powerful resistance to rot and decay, a quality that could be sympathetically transferred to a festering human wound. A wolf, fierce and rarely bested in a fight, imparted its protective ferocity through a necklace made from its tooth. This wasn't merely a quaint belief, it was a logical extension of observing the natural world and attempting to harness its perceived order for human benefit. The healer was acting as a kind of symbolic chemist, combining ingredients based on their perceived metaphysical properties as much as their physical ones. The preparation of these remedies was a meticulous process, steeped in ritual that further demonstrated the healer's deep connection to the natural cycles. An animal part wasn't simply collected, it was harvested at a specific time, often under a particular moon phase or during a specific season, to capture its essence at peak potency. The act of creation was just as important as the ingredients themselves. This attention to detail reveals a sophisticated, albeit non-scientific, methodology. They were observing correlations. If a patient wearing a badger's tooth recovered from a respiratory illness, that correlation was noted and repeated, building a body of practical, experiential evidence that validated the initial sympathetic principle. Yet, it was this very practicality that made the practices so dangerously heretical in the eyes of the Church. While herbalism could, at a stretch, be framed as simply using God's creation, animal-based sympathetic magic was almost impossible to separate from outright paganism. It relied on a worldview where power was inherent in creation itself, accessible to anyone who knew how to read the symbols and perform the correct rituals. This completely bypassed the Church as the necessary intermediary between humanity and divine power. When a healer cured an infection with a toadskin poultice, she wasn't channeling God's grace through prayer. She was directly manipulating the natural world's hidden forces based on her own knowledge. This was a declaration of independence that theocratic authorities could not abide. Specific practices were particularly inflammatory. The use of parts from animals associated with the devil in Christian iconography, like goats or bats, was seen as definitive proof of demon worship. Even more damning were remedies that involved transference, where the disease was believed to be passed from the human to the animal. A common practice involved placing a live toad or spider on a boil or plague sore, believing the creature would draw the venom and sickness into itself, dying in the process. To the healer and patient, this was a logical act of sacrifice and cleansing. To a clerical inquisitor, it was a dark ritual of offering, a feeding of a human ailment to a familiar spirit. The line between folk medicine and witchcraft vanished entirely in these moments. The healer's intent was to heal, but her methods painted a picture of someone trafficking with the very forces of darkness the Church was sworn to combat. Her compassionate act of drawing out illness could be meticulously recorded in a trial transcript as the definitive evidence of her pact with the devil, proving that in a world governed by fear, the most innovative healers were always just one failed cure away from the flames. But to fully appreciate the healer's craft, we must look beyond the forest floor and the animal kingdom and lift our gaze to the stars. For many medieval healers, the most sophisticated diagnostic tool wasn't a mortar and pestle, but an astrological chart. This was a world where the human body was seen as a perfect microcosm of the universe, a mirror reflecting the celestial macrocosm above. Every organ, every humor, every ailment was believed to be governed by the influence of a specific planet or zodiac sign. This wasn't seen as magic in the common sense, but as a higher science, a complex mathematical system that mapped the invisible forces connecting humanity to the cosmos. To ignore these forces was to practice medicine blindly. To understand them was to wield the most powerful healing art of all. The system was astonishingly detailed and precise. A healer would cast a patient's natal chart to understand their inherent physical strengths and weaknesses, their temperament, and their predisposition to certain diseases. But the real daily work was in electional astrology, choosing the perfect moment to act. The moon was the most crucial timekeeper. Its phases governed the movement of the body's fluids, much as it governed the ocean's tides. Bloodletting, a common practice to balance the humors, was strictly forbidden when the moon was in a sign that governed the part of the body to be bled, as it was believed the tide of blood would be too strong and the patient could bleed to death. Surgery was only performed during the waning moon, a time for decrease and removal, to ensure swelling would subside and wounds would heal cleanly. Even the gathering of herbs was a celestial art. Roots were harvested in the dark of the moon when energy was concentrated downward, while flowers were picked under the full moon to capture their peak vitality. Each plant, too, was ruled by a planet liverwort by Jupiter, the organ it treated, peppery, fiery plants by Mars, cooling ones by the moon. This practice was the pinnacle of the healer's empirical and intellectual tradition. It required literacy, mathematical skill to calculate planetary hours, and a deep, synthesizing mind capable of weaving together astronomy, botany, and human physiology. A healer using astrology was not passively waiting for a sign. She was actively calculating, analyzing a web of interconnected data to determine the most auspicious time to intervene. Her success rate, while imperfect, would have been significantly higher than a practitioner who paid no heed to these cycles. Avoiding surgery during a bloody moon likely saved countless patients from hemorrhaging. Timing the administration of a tonic to when its planetary ruler was dominant may have leveraged the placebo effect, or perhaps something more subtle we still don't fully understand. It was a system of staggering complexity aimed at harmonizing human health with the rhythm of the universe itself. and it was this very sophistication that the Church found so utterly threatening. While a poultice or a charm could be dismissed as low magic or simple superstition, astrological medicine was an entirely different class of heresy. It was a coherent, rational, and compelling alternative worldview that directly challenged the core Christian doctrine of divine providence. The Church taught that God's will was absolute and inscrutable, illness was a divine punishment or test, and recovery was a miraculous gift of grace. Astrological medicine, by contrast, proposed that health and sickness operated according to a predictable, knowable set of natural laws that were impersonal and could be mastered by any human with the intellect to study them. This wasn't just dabbling in the occult, it was building a complete, self-sufficient scientific system that had no need for God's intervention or the Church's intercession. The implications were revolutionary. If a healer could accurately predict the course of an illness or ensure a surgery's success by reading the stars, then fate was not in God's hands alone. It was written in the heavens, available to anyone who could decipher the code. This idea of a predetermined celestial mechanics struck at the very heart of free will, sin, and redemption, the pillars of Christian theology. It suggested that the planets, not God, governed human affairs. The Church argued this was the worst kind of idolatry, worshipping the creation instead of the Creator. A healer drawing up an astrological chart was, in their eyes, committing a profound act of blasphemy. She was replacing prayer with calculation, faith with empiricism, and divine mystery with human arrogance. Her practice implied that God's universe could be understood and manipulated without His permission, making her not just a heretic but an architect of a godless world. In attempting to align her healing with the harmony of the spheres, she had unknowingly positioned herself as the Church's most formidable intellectual adversary. This intricate dance with the stars, however, was often brought down to earth by one of the most common and visceral of all medieval medical procedures. For the average person, the most likely encounter with any form of healing was not a complex astrological reading, but the sharp, unmistakable sting of a blade. Bloodletting was the universal prescription, a practice so deeply ingrained in medical thought that it was performed on peasants and kings alike for well over a millennium. Its foundation was not in the stars directly, but in a terrestrial framework that dictated all health and disease, the ancient theory of the four humours. This system, perfected by the Greek physician Galen and adopted with fervour by medieval scholars, proposed that the human body contained four vital fluids or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Perfect health was a state of perfect balance or eucrasia between these four. Illness was an imbalance, an excess of one humour that needed to be corrected. A fever and inflammation signaled an excess of hot, moist blood. Lethargy and congestion pointed to a surplus of cold, wet phlegm. The logic was elegant in its simplicity, and it provided a clear course of action for the healer. If there was too much blood, the solution was to remove it, thereby restoring the body's essential equilibrium. This could be a preventative measure done seasonally to maintain health, or a desperate intervention to cure everything from plague and fever to headaches and melancholy. The execution of bloodletting was a precise art, far more nuanced than simply opening a vein. A healer's skill was judged by their knowledge of where, when, and how much to bleed. The location was chosen with meticulous care, based on the principle of drawing the excess humor away from the affected organ. A headache might be treated by bleeding from the vein between the thumb and forefinger, while a liver ailment could require an incision behind the ankle. The timing, as dictated by astrology, was paramount. Certain days of the week and phases of the moon were considered favorable, while others were strictly avoided. The amount of blood to be taken was carefully measured, often into a special bowl marked with graduated lines, until the patient showed signs of relief or, just as often, fainted from blood loss, which was taken as a sign the procedure was complete. The tools of the trade were as varied as the practitioners themselves. A licensed barber surgeon operating with some degree of social approval would use a finely honed lancet. The local healer, however, might employ a more eclectic array of instruments. These could include specialized, ornate fleams with multiple blades for different types of cuts, or even the humble leech, prized for its ability to draw blood from hard-to-reach places like the gums or the nose. The use of leeches, in particular, was seen as a more gentle, controlled method, and the healer who knew the best bogs to collect them from held valuable, practical knowledge. But here, as in all things, the line between accepted practice and forbidden magic was perilously thin. The physical act of making an incision was neutral. What transformed it from medicine to witchcraft was the context and the accompaniment. If a healer performed the bloodletting at the correct astrological hour using a clean lancet, she was aligning herself with Gaelic tradition. However, if she whispered an old charm over the blade, perhaps a rhyme passed down through generations to charm the blood and stop excessive flow, she had instantly and irrevocably crossed into heresy. In that moment, the Church would argue she was no longer relying on the natural balance of humors. She was invoking a supernatural power to control the body, a power that could only come from a demonic pact. Similarly, the disposal of the blood itself was a moment of immense danger. A licensed physician would simply wash it away, but a healer might use the blood in a diagnostic ritual, dripping it into a bowl of water to read the patterns it formed, seeking clues about the illness's nature or future course. To her, this was an extension of her empirical observation. To an inquisitor, it was hydromancy, a form of divination strictly forbidden by the Church. Even the act of applying a cobweb or a specific moss to staunch the bleeding, while physiologically effective as a coagulant, could be condemned if it was done with a special incantation. Thus, a healer could perform the exact same procedure as a university-trained doctor, but her methods rooted in oral tradition, folk ritual, and a holistic view of her craft, constantly risked reinterpretation as dark sorcery. In the end, it wasn't the blade that condemned her, but the whisper that followed it. Yet of all the tools in the healer's arsenal, perhaps none was more personal, more intimate, or more damning than the human voice itself. For while herbs could be hidden and astrology charts kept secret, the spoken word was an act of power performed in the moment, a vibration in the air that could heal a body or condemn a soul. This was the world of charm healing, a practice where specific sequences of words, rhymes, and incantations were believed to hold the power to stanch blood, set bones, draw out fever, and banish infection. To dismiss these as mere superstition is to miss their profound complexity. They were, in fact, a fascinating linguistic tapestry, woven from threads of ancient pagan belief, desperate Christian faith, and raw, observed psychology. The structure of these charms reveals a sophisticated blending of worlds. A typical healing rhyme for a burn, passed down through generations, might begin by invoking the Trinity in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, a clear attempt to align the practice with approved doctrine. But the very next lines would often pivot to a pre-Christian image, commanding the fire to retreat, the heat to cool, and the pain to vanish as the sun sinks in the west. Another charm to stop bleeding might address the wound directly, narrating a mythological story where Christ himself encounters a bleeding wound on the road and commands it to cease. The power was not just in the holy names, but in the rhythmic, hypnotic cadence of the words themselves, a cadence that often had more in common with ancient poetic meter than with church liturgy. These were not random phrases, they were carefully crafted verbal spells where the sound, the rhythm, and the intent were all precisely aligned to produce a specific effect on the patient's body and mind. The healer's delivery was a performance of deep conviction. She would often recite the words in a low, steady murmur, sometimes breathing them directly onto the wound or the afflicted area, transferring the power of the speech with her own breath, the very essence of life. For a patient writhing in pain or trembling with fever, This ritual was itself a powerful medicine. The focused attention, the soothing rhythm of the rhyme, the unwavering certainty in the healer's voice, all of it would trigger a profound placebo effect, reducing anxiety, allowing the body's own healing mechanisms to engage, and often producing genuine, observable relief. The charm was a psychological catalyst, a way of focusing belief and expectation into a tangible outcome. When a frightened child's bleeding slowed after such a chant, it was evidence enough for the healer and the community that the words themselves held power. But to the medieval church, this syncretic blend of the sacred and the profane was not innovative. It was the most dangerous form of blasphemy. The problem was not the use of Christian prayer. The church encouraged prayer for the sick. The problem was the method. Approved prayer was a humble supplication to God, acknowledging His ultimate will and power. The healing charm, by contrast, was a command. Its formulaic, repetitive nature treated holy words like a recipe or a chemical ingredient, as if the precise sequence itself forced a desired outcome, effectively attempting to manipulate divine power rather than respectfully request it. This was the magic of compulsion, not the faith of petition. It reduced the names of God and Christ to mere words of power, no different from a pagan invocation, stripping them of their sacred meaning and using them as tools in a ritual God never sanctioned. The Church Fathers argued that if a charm worked where a standard prayer did not, it could not be the work of God. Why would the Almighty respond to a magical formula but ignore the sincere, humble prayers of a priest? The only logical conclusion from their perspective was that the power behind the charm was demonic. The devil, they believed, was a deceiver. He would allow a minor healing, stopping a cut from bleeding or easing a burn, to lure the healer and her patient into a false sense of security, thereby ensnaring their souls for damnation. The inclusion of Christian elements made the deception all the more insidious, as it tricked people into believing they were still within the bounds of their faith. Every time a village healer successfully used a rhyming charm that began, "In the name of the Lord," she was, in the eyes of the church, not performing a miracle, but conducting a transaction with the devil, trading a soul for a superficial cure. Her voice, intended as an instrument of compassion, became the primary evidence against her, a recorded incantation that proved she knew the devil's language and had used it to usurp the authority of God. Yet within this treacherous landscape of healing, one area was considered so volatile, so intimate, and so threatening to the established order that it existed in a category of danger all its own: the realm of women's medicine. Here, the healer was almost always a woman herself, and her patient was another. Their encounters took place behind closed doors, in the blood and mystery of the birthing chamber, in the quiet confidences about monthly cycles and unwanted pregnancies. This was knowledge that belonged exclusively to women, a body of wisdom passed from mother to daughter and midwife to apprentice, completely separate from the male-dominated worlds of the university, the monastery, and the law. And for that very reason, it was viewed with the deepest suspicion and fear. The midwife was the central figure in this clandestine network. Her role extended far beyond simply catching babies. She was a master of female physiology, a walking encyclopedia of herbal lore specifically for women's bodies. She knew which herbs could regulate a irregular cycle or ease the crippling cramps of menstruation. She possessed recipes for emmenagogue substances to stimulate menstrual flow, which could also be used as early abortifacients in a desperate situation. Pennyroyal, tansy, rue, and savin were all part of her arsenal, plants with powerful and potentially toxic properties that she learned to administer with precise, life-saving care. Her knowledge offered women a semblance of control over their own fertility and destinies in a society that granted them almost none, making her both a vital lifeline and a profound threat. Childbirth itself was her sovereign domain, a bloody battlefield where life and death danced too close for comfort. The church, for all its power, had no place here. A priest might be called at the very end to perform an emergency baptism if the infant was dying, but the entire grueling, dangerous process was managed by women. The midwife used her hands to turn babies in the womb, her herbal brews to stimulate stalled labor, and her experienced eye to predict complications. She was the one who faced the heart-wrenching dilemmas when to try and save the mother when a child could not be born alive, how to manage a miscarriage. These were the darkest, most difficult moments of human existence, and she navigated them with a pragmatic compassion that existed entirely outside the Church's moral framework. It was this very autonomy that made her a target. In the eyes of the male authorities, the all-female space of the birthing room was a place of unsettling secrecy. What rituals were performed there, what words were spoken, the most persistent and damning accusation leveled against midwives was that they secretly baptized newborns not in the name of the Holy Trinity, but in the name of the devil, offering these innocent souls to his service. Another chilling claim was that they procured the bodies of unbaptized infants or the organs of stillborn children for use in the most potent black magic rituals. These accusations were almost universally fabricated, but they reveal a deep, pathological anxiety about female power over the very origins of life. If a midwife could bring life into the world, the fearful logic went, perhaps she could also traffic with darker forces and decide who lived or died. A failed birth was often the catalyst for disaster. If a mother or child died under a midwife's care, grief could quickly curdle into vengeful suspicion. Had she used a strange herb, had she murmured an unusual prayer, the same desperate measures she took to try and save a life could be twisted in retrospect into evidence of maleficent intent. Her knowledge of contraceptives and abortifacients, while a practical necessity for women facing poverty, shame, or danger, was framed not as healthcare but as the murder of unborn children and a sinful thwarting of God's will. The midwife held the keys to the most intimate aspects of women's lives, and in a culture obsessed with controlling female sexuality and reproduction, her authority was a direct challenge to both ecclesiastical and patriarchal power. She was walking proof that women did not need men to interpret or manage their bodies, and for that independence she paid the highest price. And so we arrive at the final, and perhaps most unsettling, frontier of the healer's desperate search for cures, a practice that forced them to confront not just the forest or the stars, but the grave itself. If the body was a microcosm of the universe, then some healers believed its physical remnants, even in death, held a concentrated, lingering power. This led to a branch of medicine that seems to us now like a grotesque parody. The use of human remains as a fundamental ingredient in the pharmacopoeia. For centuries across Europe, ailing patients were prescribed medicines containing ground-up mummies, scrapings from human skulls, and even the fat and blood of the recently deceased. This was not the dark art of a storybook, which it was for a time an accepted, if extreme, facet of mainstream medical thought. The most famous of these macabre remedies was mumia, or mummy powder. This wasn't typically from actual Egyptian mummies initially, though a roaring trade in those developed later to meet demand. Originally, it referred to the bitumen or asphalt that was believed to seep from the mountains where ancient bodies were buried. But by the late medieval period, the meaning had shifted. Mumia came to mean the ground-up, preserved flesh of any human corpse, preferably one that had met a sudden or violent end. The logic, stemming from the same sympathetic principles that guided herbalism, was that a body preserved from corruption must possess a powerful embalming force within it, a vital, life-arresting essence that could be transferred to a living patient to halt internal decay, stop hemorrhages, and cure a vast array of diseases from epilepsy to the plague. A powder made from such a corpse was seen as the ultimate concentrate of this life-preserving power. Equally widespread was the use of usnea, or skull moss. This was the moss or lichen that grew on the weathered skulls of the dead, often those left exposed on battlefields or swinging from gibbets. The healer would carefully gather this moss, believing it had absorbed the pneuma, the vital spirit or life force of the deceased. It was primarily used as a drastic treatment for ailments of the head, especially severe nosebleeds and epilepsy, the logic being that the spirit within the moss could overpower the chaotic sickness disrupting the patient's own spirit. Another grim staple was mandragora, not to be confused with the mandrake root, which was a salve made by steeping a hanged man's fat in alcohol or oil. This unguent was then rubbed on the skin to relieve pain, particularly the agony of gout or rheumatism, the sympathy here lying in the application of a substance that had once animated a human form to a body that was now failing. The methods of obtaining these ingredients placed the healer in a shadowy, dangerous world. They often worked in concert with the local executioner, who had ready access to the bodies of the condemned. A healer might pay for the right to collect blood from a freshly beheaded criminal, believing its warm, vital flow was most potent. They might visit gallows under cover of darkness to gather moss from a skull that had weathered for years, or even procure an entire skeleton for their supplies. This created a grisly economy around the outskirts of official justice, where the bodies of sinners and criminals were transformed into sought-after medical commodities. For the healer, this was a grim but necessary procurement. They were simply harvesting the most powerful ingredients available to them, driven by a utilitarian desire to save lives by any means possible. But to the medieval church, these practices were an abomination of the highest order, a profound desecration that blurred the line between medicine and the most blackened necromancy. The church's view was based on a sacred theology of the body. According to Christian doctrine, the human body was a temple of the Holy Spirit, created in the image of God and destined for resurrection on the last day. To deliberately dismember it, grind it into powder, or apply it as a salve was not just disrespectful. It was a direct attack on God's creation and a horrific parody of the holy resurrection. It treated the sacred vessel of a human soul as a mere collection of chemical compounds, a commodity to be exploited. Furthermore, the use of remains, especially those of the executed, was seen as inherently polluting. These were the bodies of sinners, individuals who had died outside of God's grace. Using their physical matter in a medicine was believed to transfer not just their physical essence, but their spiritual corruption into the patient. The church argued that any cure derived from such a source could not possibly be wholesome. It would heal the body only to damn the soul, a transaction far more costly than any disease. This directly inverted the healer's sympathetic logic. Where she saw preserving life force, the church saw the ingestion of sin. Most damning of all, the practice was indistinguishable from necromancy, the summoning of and bargaining with the dead. The line was incredibly thin. If a healer used a moss that had grown on a skull, was she not also attempting to harness the spirit of the person who once owned it? If she collected blood from an execution, was she not capturing the very moment of death, a potent and dangerous spiritual event? The church firmly believed that any ritual involving human remains risked attracting the attention of the deceased's restless spirit, or worse, a demon masquerading as that spirit. Therefore, the healer who dealt in mumia and usnea was not a physician but a grave-robbing sorcerer, meddling with forces that were expressly forbidden. Her attempts to harness the power of death to prolong life were the ultimate act of hubris, placing her craft in direct opposition to the divine cycle of life, death, and resurrection ordained by God. In seeking to heal, she had committed the final, unforgivable sacrilege. Imagine a healer's cottage dimly lit by a single candle, the air thick with the scent of drying herbs. A worried villager enters, clutching a flask of his own urine, while another sits, extending a wrist across a rough-hewn table. In that quiet space, two of the most common diagnostic arts of the Middle Ages were about to unfold, practices so nuanced that a master could read the body's deepest secrets in a liquid's hue or the thrum of a vein. yet so perilous that too much skill could mark that same healer for the stake. Uroscopy, the examination of urine, and sphygmology, the reading of the pulse, were the cornerstones of medieval diagnosis. They required a keen eye, a sensitive touch, and an encyclopedic knowledge of the humoral theory that governed all medicine. For the healer, these were tools of empirical observation. For the authorities watching, they were a potential window into witchcraft. Uroscopy was far more than a simple glance. It was a complex, almost ritualistic analysis. The healer would receive the urine flask, often a specialized vessel called a macula, and hold it up to the light. She wasn't just looking for color, she was conducting a full sensory investigation. The color spectrum itself was a detailed map of disease. A pale, watery yellow might indicate an excess of phlegm and a cold, damp condition within the body. A deep, fiery red suggested a surfeit of blood and a state of dangerous inflammation. A dark, blackish hue pointed to an excess of black bile, the melancholic humor, and could signal a severe systemic illness. But the diagnosis went deeper. She would observe the consistency. Was the urine clear or cloudy? If there was cloudiness, was the sediment light and floating or heavy and settled at the bottom? She might even note the smell, and in some extreme cases even taste a drop, believing it could offer clues about the internal heat of the body's processes. Each of these observations was meticulously cross-referenced with the patient's symptoms to pinpoint the humoral imbalance. A cloudy urine with a white sediment, for instance, confirmed a cold, phlegmatic disorder, perhaps an ague or a rheumatic complaint. Pulse reading was its equally sophisticated counterpart. This was not merely counting heartbeats. The healer's fingers would rest lightly on the radial artery of the wrist, feeling for a universe of information in its rhythm. The pulse had a personality. It could be strong or weak, fast or slow, but it could also be what physicians called hard or soft, full or empty, regular or intermittent. A strong, bounding pulse signaled heat and an excess of blood, often seen in fevers. A weak, thready pulse indicated coldness and a deficiency of vitality. A pulse that felt hard and wiry might suggest an excess of yellow bile and choler. The healer would also note its rhythm against her own breathing or even a water clock, assessing its pace and consistency. This tactile art required years of practice to master the subtle variations, to feel the story the blood was telling as it pushed through the vessel. A skilled practitioner could differentiate between a pulse that indicated simple anxiety and one that pointed to a failing heart, a crucial diagnostic distinction that could mean the difference between a soothing tea and a desperate intervention. For the community, a healer's proficiency in these arts was a marvel. When she could correctly diagnose a hidden pregnancy from the specific quality of a pulse or identify a liver malady from the deep orange hue of a urine sample, it confirmed her status as a gifted and essential figure. Her accuracy was a comfort, a sign that someone could truly see and understand the invisible suffering within the body. This success, however, was a double-edged sword. The same diagnostic victory that earned her the gratitude of her neighbors could also attract the baleful gaze of the church. The line between brilliant empirical observation and forbidden divination was terrifyingly thin. How could a woman with no formal university training possibly discern such specific details from a flask of waste or a fleeting heartbeat? To a suspicious mind, her success couldn't be natural. This is where the healer's craft risked being reinterpreted as demonic assistance. If her diagnosis was unusually precise, if she correctly predicted the course of an illness with uncanny accuracy, or identified a malady that had baffled everyone else, it raised a dangerous question: how did she really know? The Church taught that such knowledge of hidden things could only come from two sources: divine revelation or a demonic informant. Since she was not a saint receiving visions from God, the only logical conclusion for an inquisitor was that a familiar spirit was whispering the diagnosis in her ear as she gazed into the urine flask. The act of holding the macula up to the light could be maliciously reimagined as scrying, a form of crystal gazing using the liquid as a dark mirror into the patient's future. The careful, rhythmic counting of a pulse could be twisted into a trance-like state, a communion with an unnatural force that was feeding her information. Her meticulous, hard-won skill became the primary evidence against her, proof that she operated with an aid that bypassed both the church and nature itself. In striving to be the most accurate physician she could be, she inadvertently provided her accusers with all the proof they needed to condemn her for trafficking with the unseen world. But the most secretive and misunderstood of all their preparations were the potent flying salves, thick, greasy unguents that promised not just to heal the body, but to liberate the spirit entirely. These were not concoctions for the faint of heart. Their base was often a simple animal fat or plant oil, but their active ingredients were a powerful cocktail of the most dangerous herbs in the healer's garden: belladonna with its dark, gleaming berries, henbane with its pale, ghostly flowers, and mandrake, the shrieking root. Combined, these plants created a powerful psychoactive mixture, a gateway to experiences so profound and terrifying that they would forever seal the healer's reputation as a witch. The application was a ritual in itself. The healer wouldn't drink this potion knowing its toxicity if ingested. Instead, she would rub it thickly onto her skin, concentrating on areas where the blood ran close to the surface: the temples, the wrists, the inner thighs, and most effectively, the sensitive mucous membranes. To accelerate absorption, she might even use a staff or a broomstick to apply the salve, a practical method that would later be grotesquely misinterpreted. As the skin grew warm and the body absorbed the tropane alkaloids from the plants, the effects would begin. The heart rate would slow, the mouth would become parched, and a deep, trance-like sleep would descend. But this was no ordinary sleep. This was a journey. In this altered state, the healer would experience vivid, often terrifying hallucinations. The sensation of weightlessness and flight was a common report, a feeling of soaring over the village, traveling vast distances, and attending secret gatherings. These were not literal flights, but powerful out-of-body experiences induced by the chemical cocktail now coursing through her system. For the healer, this was likely a sacred rite, a way to gain visionary knowledge, commune with spirits of nature, or perhaps even diagnose a patient's illness through spiritual travel. The salve was a key to an unseen world, a tool for exploration that existed far beyond the understanding of conventional medicine. In her mind, she wasn't attending a witch's Sabbath. She was embarking on a shamanic journey, a tradition with roots far older than Christianity. For the patient, these same ointments, in carefully diluted forms, served a much more grounded purpose: profound pain relief. Applied topically to a throbbing wound or an arthritic joint, the same numbing, analgesic properties that induced visions could also bring blessed numbness to physical agony. A healer might use a minute amount of belladonna in a poultice to ease the muscle spasms of a patient in the final, painful stages of lockjaw, or a salve with henbane to allow a mother to rest after a traumatic birth. In an age without effective anesthetics, these plants were among the most powerful tools available to combat human suffering, and the healers who wielded them did so with a deep, respectful understanding of their narrow margin between therapy and toxicity. Yet, every aspect of this practice, from its ingredients to its effects, was a recipe for condemnation in the eyes of the authorities. The very plants used: belladonna, beautiful lady, used by women to dilate their pupils; henbane, known for its venomous properties, were associated with poison and deception. When a suspected witch was examined, inquisitors would often look for devil's marks, areas of numb or insensitive skin, which were likely nothing more than minor nerve damage or the residual effects of their own topical analgesics. But the most damning evidence came from the healers themselves, often under torture. They would describe their experiences with the flying salve in the only language they had. They spoke of flying to a Sabbath, feasting with the devil, and engaging in unholy rites. The authorities took these confessions at face value as proof of a literal pact. They could not conceive of a chemical-induced trance state. The practical broomstick used for application became a literal vehicle for flight. The feeling of weightlessness was evidence of supernatural travel. The delirious visions of gatherings were confessed as eyewitness accounts of satanic meetings. The Church saw in these stories a perfect mirror of their own theology of sin. A willing mortal anointing herself with a demonic unguent, renouncing her baptism, and physically traveling to pledge her soul to the devil. The healer's attempt to transcend physical pain and access spiritual knowledge was systematically recast as the ultimate act of apostasy. Her most powerful medicine became the incontrovertible proof of her witchcraft, not because it was magic, but because it worked in a way that only magic, in the eyes of her accusers, possibly could. Yet beyond the potent salves and diagnostic arts lay a form of healing so fundamental, so intuitively human, that it required no tools at all, only the human hand. In a world riddled with plague and pain, the simple, compassionate act of touch offered a profound solace, a direct transmission of comfort and care that often seemed to work its own kind of quiet miracle. For the common village healer, this was a natural extension of her craft. She would lay her hands on a fevered brow to soothe a restless child, massage strained muscles to ease a laborer's ache, or gently manipulate a dislocated joint back into its socket. This was the medicine of physical presence, a practice rooted in the observable reality that a caring touch could calm the spirit and sometimes even mend the body. Her hands were her most reliable instruments, trained through years of experience to feel the subtle misalignments in a bone, the tense knots in a muscle, or the alarming heat of an infection. This practice, however, existed in a shadowy realm of its own. While the Church itself had a long tradition of the laying on of hands for spiritual healing, a practice meant to channel the Holy Spirit through the ordained priesthood, the same act performed by an unlicensed woman was viewed through an entirely different lens. Her touch was not sanctified by holy orders. If a patient recovered after she had massaged a painful limb or held their hand through a fever, where did that power originate? The Church's answer was grimly consistent. Any healing power not explicitly granted by God through the Church must therefore be demonic. Her compassionate touch could be maliciously reinterpreted as a physical transfer of a malignant charm or the secret marking of a patient for future demonic claim. The intimacy of the act itself was suspect, occurring in private spaces away from supervision, allowing fear and rumor to fester. What words did she whisper as she worked? What secret signs might she be tracing on the skin? Her most human impulse to offer comfort became, in the paranoid climate of the times, her greatest vulnerability. This stark contrast between sanctioned and unsanctioned touch is thrown into its sharpest relief by the most famous example of all, the royal touch. For centuries throughout England and France, it was widely believed that monarchs, anointed by God at their coronation, possessed a divine gift to heal a specific ailment known as scrofula, or the king's evil. This was a tubercular infection of the lymph nodes in the neck, which caused unsightly, suppurating swellings. The ceremony was a grand public spectacle, a fusion of church and state designed to reinforce the divine right of kings. On appointed holy days, the afflicted would line up by the hundreds. The king or queen would process into a grand hall, often after a religious service. Each sufferer would kneel before the throne, and the monarch would gently touch their sores, sometimes making the sign of the cross over them. Each patient would then receive a gold coin, called an angel, hung on a ribbon around their neck, completing the ritual of both spiritual and charitable healing. The psychological and political power of this practice was immense. For the common people, it was a rare chance for direct, physical contact with a figure believed to be God's representative on earth. The sheer pageantry of the event, the presence of clergy, the awe-inspiring setting, the palpable faith of the crowd created a powerful placebo effect that likely did bring real relief to some. For the monarchy, it was a masterstroke of propaganda. The ability to heal was the ultimate proof of their God-given legitimacy, a visible, miraculous sign that set them apart from ordinary mortals and cemented their authority. It transformed the sovereign from a political ruler into a thaumaturge, a wonder worker whose very body held a sacred power. The cruel irony, of course, was staggering. A village Helander who used her hands to massage a cramped muscle or set a broken bone risked being accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake. Yet a king, performing a nearly identical act of touch in a cathedral with bishops in attendance, was celebrated as a holy vessel of God's grace. The difference was not in the action itself, but in the authority behind it. The royal touch was acceptable because it was a public ritual, tightly controlled by the church, and it reinforced the hierarchical power structure. It proclaimed that healing grace could only flow down from God through his anointed king and onto the grateful masses. The healer's touch, by contrast, was horizontal. It passed between equals from one member of the community to another, based on skill and compassion rather than divinely ordained rank. Her power came from below, from the earth, and from generations of accumulated wisdom, not from the top down. This independent authority was the true heresy. It suggested that the sacred could be accessed directly through human knowledge and empathy, without the need for priest or king. In the end, the condemnation of her healing hands was never really about magic. It was about a power structure terrified of any challenge to its monopoly on hope. Woven into the very fabric of daily life, often resting against the skin itself, was another layer of the healer's protective craft, the amulet. These were not mere decorations. They were portable pharmacies, compact rituals, and divine petitions, all condensed into an object small enough to be carried in a pocket or hung around the neck. In a world teeming with unseen dangers, from the evil eye and demonic influences to the sudden onset of plague, these talismans served as a constant, tangible shield, a physical expression of hope and an application of sympathetic magic that everyone, from the poorest farmer to the wealthiest merchant, could understand and utilize. The creation of an amulet was a sacred act of synthesis, combining multiple elements into a single, powerful focus. The base object itself was chosen for its inherent sympathetic properties. A smooth, cool stone like hematite, with its rusty red streak reminiscent of dried blood, was the obvious choice for amulets designed to staunch bleeding or ease menstrual cramps. A piece of amber, warm to the touch and seemingly capturing sunlight within it, was employed to combat the cold, damp humors associated with rheumatism and ague. Even simple nuts like the horse chestnut carried in a pocket to ward off arthritis were selected for their resemblance to aching joints. Into this base, the healer would incorporate further layers of power. Small sachets might be sewn from cloth and filled with protective herbs, rue to turn away malice, or lavender to soothe a troubled mind and promote peaceful sleep. The most potent amulets, however, involved the written word. The healer, or sometimes a local monk hired for the task, would inscribe tiny slips of parchment or vellum with sacred words, symbols, or prayers. These could be the names of the three magi Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, believed to be powerful protectors against falling sickness and sudden death. Other popular inscriptions included magical squares of letters, the Greek vowels thought to represent the music of the spheres, or abbreviations of Latin prayers like the powerful Agla, which stood for Atha Jebri Lelam Adonai, Thou art mighty forever, O Lord. For a patient suffering from a fever, the healer might write a phrase from a gospel on a parchment and have them wear it on their body. The words themselves, in contact with the skin, were believed to transfer their holy power into the afflicted flesh. The final construction was often an intricate artifact, a written prayer folded tightly and sealed with wax, then sewn into a small bag of leather or cloth alongside specific herbs, the whole thing then worn on a cord. Their application was as varied as their design. Some were meant to be worn constantly, like a pendant carved from jet for a woman in childbirth to ensure a safe delivery. Others were applied directly to the point of pain. A stone amulet might be dipped in water first, and then the infused liquid would be used to wash a wound. Certain talismans were seasonal, created during astrologically potent times like the solstice or eclipse to capture that specific celestial energy for use throughout the year. The healer's role was to diagnose not just the illness but the most likely spiritual cause behind it, and then craft the precise counter-charm required. A child plagued by night terrors would receive a different amulet than a farmer worried about blight affecting his crops, each one a bespoke solution to a specific fear. To the common person, this was a logical extension of faith. The written prayers were Christian, the symbols were often crosses or monograms of Christ, and the intent was to harness divine power for protection. It felt like an active, participatory form of piety, but to the medieval church hierarchy, these objects were a perversion of devotion and a direct challenge to its authority. The core of the church's objection was the principle of intention. Approved religious objects like a rosary or a saint's relic housed in a cathedral were meant to focus the mind on God and inspire sincere internal prayer. The amulet, by contrast, was believed to work automatically, almost mechanically, through the power of its physical composition and inscription. The wearer wasn't necessarily engaging in heartfelt prayer. They were simply carrying a magical object that they believed would deflect harm regardless of their spiritual state. This was the magic of compulsion, not the faith of supplication. Theologians argued that this practice diverted true faith from the divine to the object itself, a classic case of idolatry. It taught people to trust in a crafted item rather than in God's merciful will. If an amulet worked, it couldn't be God's work because God would not respond to a magical formula but only to humble, pious prayer. Therefore, the power behind any successful amulet had to be demonic. The devil, they reasoned, was a deceiver who would allow a small, protective benefit, a eased headache, a avoided cold, to lure the user into a false sense of security and a deeper dependence on forbidden magic, ultimately ensnaring their soul. The inclusion of Christian elements made the sin even worse, as it blasphemously used holy words as mere spells, stripping them of their sacred meaning and reducing them to functional components in a recipe. The healer who crafted these talismans was therefore seen as a spiritual poisoner, mixing faith with superstition and leading her community away from the true path of salvation, all under the compassionate guise of offering them comfort and protection. But the healer's quest to understand the body's hidden secrets did not cease when the patient fell asleep. In the silent theater of the night, they believed another diagnostic window opened, one where the soul itself could reveal the humors raging within. Dream interpretation was not a matter of superstition for these practitioners. It was a sophisticated diagnostic art, a logical extension of the belief that the body and spirit were inextricably linked. While the waking patient might conceal or misunderstand their symptoms, their dreams, they thought, offered an uncensored, symbolic map of internal imbalances, a direct line to the root cause of suffering. This tradition drew from ancient, revered sources that had filtered down through the centuries. The works of Greek physicians like Galen and Hippocrates discussed dreams as indicators of physical health, suggesting that certain recurring visions pointed to specific humoral excesses. Even earlier, in 2nd century Egypt, a text known as the Onura Critica by Artemidorus offered a vast catalogue of dream symbols and their meanings, which medieval healers adapted and blended with local folklore. This created a rich, if sometimes contradictory, body of knowledge where classical learning met village wisdom. The healer became a translator of this nocturnal language, trained to listen to a patient's dream narrative with the same analytical focus she applied to examining urine or feeling a pulse. The symbolic vocabulary she worked with was detailed and precise. A common, suffocating dream of being trapped or drowning was rarely seen as simple anxiety. It was a classic sign of an overabundance of the cold, wet phlegmatic humor, suggesting congestion in the lungs or head. Vivid, violent dreams of battles, fire, and rage indicated an excess of the hot, dry, choleric humor, pointing to inflammation, fever, or liver problems. Dreams of wandering, lost in a desert, or searching futilely for water signaled a dominance of the hot, dry yellow bile, often associated with digestive issues and burning fevers. More specific symbols had direct correlations. Dreaming of falling teeth might predict bone aches or rheumatic pains, while visions of spoiled food could indicate a corruption in the stomach or bowels. The healer would carefully correlate these dream reports with the patient's waking symptoms, using the former to confirm her suspicions about the latter and to choose the most appropriate herbal or dietary regimen to rebalance the humors. For the Church, however, this practice crossed a dangerous and unambiguous line. The key distinction lay in the purpose. The Church acknowledged that some dreams could be divine messages or, conversely, demonic temptations. But these were matters of spirituality to be discussed with a priest for the good of the soul. The healer's use of dreams was entirely different. It was a form of divination, an attempt to gain knowledge of hidden things, in this case the course of a physical illness, through a supernatural means. By claiming to diagnose disease from dreams, the healer was essentially practicing oneromancy, an art explicitly condemned in the Bible. Theologians argued that this sought to unravel God's will before he chose to reveal it. Illness was a divine mystery. Its duration and outcome were part of God's plan. To try and predict it through the interpretation of dreams was an arrogant attempt to circumvent divine providence, to see into the future that belonged to God alone. Furthermore, the source of the dream's knowledge was immediately suspect. If the dream contained accurate diagnostic information that the healer could not have known naturally, how did it get there? Since God would not use such a mundane method to convey medical advice, the only other source in the Church's rigid worldview was the devil. A healer who correctly predicted a fever's break based on a dream symbol was not therefore celebrated for her skill. She was feared for her apparent communion with unclean spirits feeding her information. Her compassionate attempt to use every available tool to understand her patient's ailment was systematically recast as a forbidden pact, making the vulnerable world of sleep yet another battleground where her craft was condemned. But of all the physical interventions a healer might attempt, none was more drastic, more dangerous, or more visibly dramatic than the practice of trepanning, the act of deliberately drilling or scraping a hole into a living human skull. This was not a common procedure, reserved for the most desperate of cases, often following a severe head injury. The medical theory behind it was a brutal, direct logic. Physicians and healers observed that a blow to the head often resulted in swelling, convulsions, personality changes, and death. They deduced that a harmful substance was trapped inside the skull, a buildup of corrupted blood or a morbid humoral vapor, and that the pressure needed to be released. The skull was seen as a sealed container. Trepanning was the act of opening a vent to let the malady escape, a last-ditch effort to relieve the intense pressure and restore the patient's natural balance. The tools for this harrowing operation were as simple as they were terrifying. A skilled practitioner might use a modified version of a carpenter's brace and bit, a tool designed for wood now applied to human bone. Others employed a handled trephine, a cylindrical saw with a central pin to guide the cut and prevent slippage. For those without access to such specialized instruments, the work might be done with a simple, sharpened knife or even a hard stone flake, using a scraping motion to slowly, agonizingly wear away the bone. There was no effective anesthetic beyond strong herbal intoxicants or alcohol to dull the senses. The patient would have to be held down, fully conscious, as the healer began the grueling process of cutting through the scalp, moving aside the tissue, and then applying the drill or scraper to the exposed bone itself. The sound alone, the grating, grinding screech of metal on bone, would have been a stuff of nightmares. Given these conditions, the survival rates are astonishing to consider. Archaeological evidence from medieval skulls shows clear signs of healing around trepanation holes. proving that a significant number of patients not only survived the initial horror of the operation but lived for years afterward. This is a testament to the remarkable skill and steady nerve of the practitioners. They knew precisely how deep to go, penetrating the bone but avoiding the delicate dura mater, the protective membrane surrounding the brain. They understood the importance of post-operative care, using herbal poultices to prevent infection and keep the wound clean. A successful trepanation, where a comatose or violently ill patient woke up lucid and recovered, was the pinnacle of a healer's career. It was a visible, miraculous-seeming feat that could earn her legendary status and the unwavering loyalty of an entire community. Yet, this same act of life-saving bravery could, in the blink of an eye, become the very proof needed to condemn her. The line between miraculous surgeon and malicious which was drawn by the outcome. If the patient died on the table, as so many inevitably did from shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection, grief could quickly curdle into accusation. The healer's methods were already shrouded in necessary secrecy and ritual. She might have recited a specific charm to steady her hand or to bless her tools, a practice meant to focus her intent and calm the patient. To a hostile observer, these murmurs were not prayers but incantations, and the act of cutting into the sacred temple of the human body was a desecration. A failed operation could be framed not as a medical tragedy, but as a ritual killing, a sacrifice to dark forces. Even the tools themselves could be damned by association. The trephine, with its sharp, spiraling teeth, could be labeled a devil's instrument. The collection of the bone dust, sometimes saved for use in other potions, was seen as the gathering of grisly ingredients for witchcraft. Most damning of all was the simple, unbearable fact of her action. She had opened a person's head and peered inside. In a culture that believed the soul resided within the skull, this was the ultimate transgression. How could an ordinary woman possess the knowledge and the audacity to violate the very vessel of human identity and not be in league with the devil? Her success proved her power, and her power in a world governed by fear was all the evidence an inquisitor needed. The healer who performed trepanning lived on a knife's edge, celebrated as an angel of mercy one day, and accused of trafficking with the darkest forces the next, her greatest medical achievement, simultaneously her most damning criminal act. When the remedies of the cottage and the charms of the hearth failed, the medieval healer had one more profound recourse: a journey. This was not a journey to a physician or a monastery, but a pilgrimage to a place where the veil between the earthly and the divine was believed to be tissue-thin. Patients would be led, sometimes carried, to ancient sacred sites: a moss-covered standing stone in a forgotten field, a gnarled oak tree older than memory, or, most commonly, a holy well whose waters bubbled up from the deep, unseen places of the earth. These locations were power spots on the medieval landscape, charged with a potent energy that transcended any single religion, and the rituals performed there represented a deep, stubborn fusion of faiths that the Church struggled for centuries to erase. The choice of site was never random. Each location had its own specific specialty, a reputation earned over generations for curing particular ailments. One well might be famed for restoring sight to the blind, its waters said to hold the memory of light. Another, nestled in a damp grove, was the destination for those suffering from skin diseases or rashes, its mud applied directly to the affected area. A crossroads, that liminal space where paths and possibilities converged, was often sought for illnesses of confusion and mental anguish, a place to literally leave one's troubles behind. This specificity reveals a sophisticated, almost clinical understanding of the landscape's symbolic and perhaps even mineral properties. A well rich in certain minerals might indeed soothe a skin condition, and the act of a long, hopeful journey itself could rally a patient's spirits in a way that passive treatment at home could not. The rituals performed were a complex tapestry woven from pagan instinct and Christian adaptation. The process often began with circumambulation. The patient would walk around the well or stone a specific number of times, always following the path of the sun, a clear echo of pre-Christian solar worship. Next came the offering. This was not a simple donation. It was a symbolic bargain, a gift given to the spirit of the place in exchange for its intercession. The most common offering was a piece of cloth, often a rag from the clothing of the sick person. After being dipped in the well's water and used to bathe the afflicted part of the body, the rag would be tied to a nearby tree, usually a hawthorn or ash believed to be a conduit to the otherworld. As the rag slowly frayed and rotted in the wind and rain, so too, it was believed, would the illness decay and vanish from the patient's body. Other offerings included pins symbolizing the sharp pain being taken away, coins a payment for service, or even small, carved crutches left behind by those who had been healed, serving as physical testaments to the site's power. Though water itself was the central actor in this drama, it was never simply drunk. The healing was in the application, the contact, the transfer of its essence. Patients would be fully immersed in well pools at dawn, or they would have the water poured over them in 3 measured doses in the name of the Trinity. They might drink it from a special cup made from a particular shell or horn, and they would always take some home, its efficacy believed to last for a season. The healer guided this entire ceremony, chanting prayers that were a fascinating syncretism. The words might begin with a Paternoster or an Ave Maria, but then seamlessly flow into a much older rhyme petitioning the genius loci, the local spirit of the spring, for mercy and healing. For the healer and the community, there was no contradiction. They were calling upon all available powers, celestial and terrestrial, to aid in their cause. For the medieval church, however, this vibrant folk practice was a persistent and maddening problem. They could not simply abolish these sites. The people's faith in them was too strong. Instead, they embarked on a centuries-long campaign of co-option and demonization. A holy well sacred to a Celtic goddess like Brigid would be rededicated to Saint Brigid. A towering oak where offerings were left would have a Christian chapel built beside it. The church would often move the saint's feast day to coincide with the older pagan festival held at that location, hoping to slowly transfer the allegiance of the people. They preached relentlessly against the vain superstitions of the well rituals. Theologians denounced the rag offering as a pagan sacrifice to demons, arguing that the true miracle was not in the water but in the Christian saint to whom the site was now dedicated. They insisted that any healing power came from God alone, and that to attribute it to the well itself or to the specific ritual performed was the sin of idolatry. This created an impossible situation for the village healer. In leading a patient to a well, she was participating in a tradition that predated Christianity by millennia, one that her community trusted implicitly. But in the eyes of the authorities, she was perpetuating a pagan survival, leading souls away from the pure font of baptism and toward the polluted waters of superstition. Her actions, though aimed at physical cure, were seen as a direct threat to the spiritual health of the entire parish. The very fact that her methods worked, or were believed to work, only made her more dangerous, as it validated a system of belief that operated outside the church's control. In guiding the sick to these liminal places, she was not just a healer, she was a guardian of the old ways, a testament to a worldview that refused to die, and for that she walked a path as perilous as any crossroads. And yet, some of the most profound and terrifying cures in the healer's arsenal came not from the benevolent earth, but from substances universally known to kill. This was the ultimate medical gamble, the deliberate use of poison as medicine. In the hands of a master, tiny, meticulously measured doses of arsenic, mercury, and lead could seemingly work miracles, blasting away stubborn diseases that defied gentler herbs. But this practice required a nerve of steel and an almost supernatural precision, for the healer who wielded these tools was dancing on the edge of a blade, where a single miscalculation could turn a cure into a murder weapon and a healer into a condemned witch. The logic behind this dangerous practice was an extension of the humoral theory pushed to its most extreme conclusion. If an illness was a violent imbalance, then sometimes only an equally violent counteragent could shock the body back into harmony. A minute dose of a known poison was seen as a kind of medical exorcism, a controlled burn to purge a more dangerous fire raging within. Arsenic, that classic agent of death, was a favored weapon against persistent fevers and wasting diseases like consumption. In infinitesimal amounts, it could stimulate a failing appetite and create a deceptively healthy flush in the cheeks, giving a patient a temporary but desperately needed surge of vitality. Mercury, in its various forms, was the go-to remedy for the most dreaded and disfiguring disease of the era, syphilis. Known as quicksilver, it was administered as a salve, a vapor to be inhaled, or even a potion. Its effects were brutal but, in the short term, could seem effective. It induced profuse salivation, which was interpreted as the body violently expelling the disease's poison. The administration of these substances was an art form of terrifying delicacy. A healer would never deal in pinches or spoonfuls. Her measurements were based on grains, often using the weight of a single wheat berry or barleycorn as her unit. She might use a delicate balance scale or, more commonly, her own experienced eye, grinding a fragment of a toxic mineral into a fine powder, and then diluting it again and again in water or wine until the final dose was a homeopathic ghost of the original poison. The margin for error was vanishingly small. The difference between a dose that stimulated a recovery and one that caused agonizing cramps, organ failure, and death could be a matter of a few granules. This required not just knowledge but an intuitive feel for each patient's constitution, a deep understanding of their individual capacity to withstand the treatment. It was the pinnacle of her craft, a demonstration of a skill so refined it bordered on the alchemical. But this mastery came at the highest possible social cost. The healer who kept jars of arsenic and mercury in her cottage was, by the very nature of her tools, living under a cloud of perpetual suspicion. Her success was her greatest vulnerability. If a patient recovered after she administered one of these drastic cures, her reputation for power grew, but so did the whispers about the dark nature of that power. How could a simple woman possibly control such deadly forces without otherworldly aid? Her ability to navigate these lethal dosages was, to a fearful neighbor, less like medical skill and more like a supernatural pact. It suggested an intimacy with death that normal people shunned. Inevitably, when a patient died, whether from the disease itself, the toxic cure, or an unrelated cause, the healer's tools became exhibit A in her condemnation. A local rival, a grieving family member looking for someone to blame, or a zealous priest could easily twist the narrative. That carefully measured dose of mercury became proof of premeditated murder. The fact that she possessed the poison at all was evidence enough for many. In the frantic, paranoid atmosphere following a sudden death, her medical rationale was meaningless. The story wrote itself. A woman with a knowledge of poisons had been present at the death. The conclusion was foregone. Her attempts to save a life with the most dangerous tools available were meticulously recast by inquisitors as a witch's experiment, a cold-blooded trial to perfect her poisons for darker purposes. In seeking to conquer death, she had made herself its prime accomplice. This clandestine communication was born from a chilling necessity, a defense mechanism honed over generations of operating under the ever-present threat of exposure. The healer's knowledge was her most precious and dangerous possession, and sharing it required a secret language, a system of codes and signs known only to a trusted few. This wasn't about mere superstition. It was a sophisticated network of covert signals designed to protect practitioners, patients, and the fragile lineage of their art from the prying eyes of the church and a suspicious public. Every aspect of their practice, from the names of plants to the way they hung herbs to dry, could carry a hidden, double meaning. The most immediate and vital layer of this code was in the very names they gave to their most powerful and controversial plants. To speak openly of belladonna or hemlock was to invite immediate danger. Instead, a rich, symbolic vernacular emerged, a set of folk names that disguised lethal poisons as harmless, even benevolent parts of the natural world. Belladonna, beautiful lady, referenced its cosmetic use to dilate pupils, but also hid its deadly nature behind a compliment. Hemlock became devil's bread or bad man's oatmeal, a grim joke that warned the initiated without uttering a dangerous word. Mandrake was rarely called by its true name. It was the womandrake, the gallows man, or the little prophet, all allusions to its human-like shape and its association with death. A healer asking an apprentice to fetch Mother of the Wood was requesting the potent and dangerous herb wormwood, while elf leaf was the common and safe lavender. This coded botany allowed them to discuss their work in public spaces, their conversations sounding like innocent chatter about gardening or cooking to any eavesdropper. This linguistic secrecy extended to the physical gestures and markings that delineated their world. The home of a healer was often subtly marked for those who knew what to look for. A specific pattern of stones in a garden wall, a particular symbol like a spiral or a certain type of knot carved into a doorframe or a gatepost, could signal to a seeking patient that they had found a safe house. The manner in which herbs were hung to dry in the rafters was not just practical. The arrangement could indicate what was available or even serve as a warning if danger was near. A bunch of rue hung upside down might mean the healer was being watched. The direction a broom was left leaning against a cottage door could silently communicate whether it was safe to enter or if a patient should come back under the cover of darkness. These silent signals created an invisible map of trust and caution that wound through the village, completely invisible to the uninitiated. The transmission of knowledge itself was the most closely guarded secret of all. Written records were incredibly rare and perilous to keep. A discovered grimoire or recipe book was a death warrant. Instead, knowledge was passed down through an oral tradition of rhyming couplets and complex mnemonics. These rhymes were easy to remember, difficult to forget, and sounded like nonsensical folk songs to anyone overhearing them. A recipe for a poultice might be encoded in a verse about a baker and his pies, with each ingredient represented by a symbol in the story. The specific phases of the moon for harvesting were remembered through a lullaby about a woman washing her hair. The doses for a dangerous preparation like a flying salve were not written in measurements, but encapsulated in a riddle. Take 3 tears of the prophet, a pinch of the lady's blush, and stir until the moon's eye winks twice. To an outsider, it was childish poetry. To an apprentice, it was a precise, memorized technical manual that contained the difference between healing and killing. This necessary secrecy, while protective, ultimately fed the very suspicions it was designed to evade. To a priest or a fearful neighbor, these coded actions were not signs of caution but of conspiracy. Why did the healers need secret names for plants if their work was godly? What were they hiding with their strange gestures and silent markings? The whispered rhymes and riddles sounded like incantations. The hidden symbols on doorframes looked like demonic sigils. Their refusal to speak plainly was interpreted as proof they were part of a hidden, malevolent network, a secret society operating in the shadows. The secret language meant to protect them became, in the hands of their accusers, the primary evidence of their guilt. It proved they knew they were doing wrong, that their craft was too dangerous to be spoken of in the light of day, cementing their image not as compassionate healers, but as members of a sinister underworld whose true loyalties were to the dark forces they served in silence. In the shadowy corners of the medieval world, where despair and delirium were poorly understood, the village healer faced one of her most complex and perilous challenges: the treatment of maladies of the mind. What we would now diagnose as depression, psychosis, or severe anxiety was then a landscape of spiritual and humoral confusion. interpreted through a lens where a distressed soul was just as likely as a distressed body. The healer's approach to these conditions was a nuanced, multi-layered practice that blended compassionate care with ritualistic intervention, a method that could just as easily mark her as a saintly intercessor as a sinister witch. Melancholy, a diagnosis that encompassed everything from profound sadness to debilitating apathy, was understood as a cold, dry affliction, an overabundance of black bile that clouded the mind and dampened the spirits. The healer's treatment was designed to counteract these qualities. She would create a regimen of warmth and moisture, prescribing herbal baths infused with moistening plants like violet and lettuce. Diet was a primary medicine. She would advise the consumption of warm, nourishing foods and wines, avoiding the cold and dry foods believed to exacerbate the condition. But beyond these physical interventions, the environment was key. Patients were encouraged to seek warmth sitting by the fire, engaging in gentle conversation, and avoiding solitude. The healer might use music, storytelling, or even assign simple, grounding tasks in the garden to draw the sufferer out of their internal labyrinth and back into the rhythm of daily life. For conditions that presented as agitation or what was termed hysteria, often ascribed to women and believed to be caused by a wandering womb, the treatments were more active. The theory held that the uterus could become dislodged and travel the body, causing choking sensations, anxiety, and outbursts. The healer's goal was to lure the womb back to its proper place. She would use foul-smelling substances like burnt feathers or pungent herbs held under the nose to repel the organ downward, while simultaneously applying sweet, pleasant fragrances like rose or lavender to the lower abdomen to attract it. This was a classic application of sympathetic magic, using opposites to restore balance. Alongside this, she might administer herbal teas with sedative properties from plants like poppy or henbane to calm the frantic energy and induce a restful state, providing a crucial respite for both the patient and their exhausted family. The most dangerous cases, however, were those interpreted as demonic possession. When a person exhibited symptoms we might now link to epilepsy, schizophrenia, or dissociative states, convulsions, speaking in unknown tongues, displaying preternatural strength or blasphemous knowledge, the situation became a spiritual emergency. Here, the healer's role dangerously overlapped with that of the priest. While the church advocated for formal exorcism, the healer's methods were often the first line of defense. She might perform her own rituals of purification, using strong-smelling herbs like rue and sage to fumigate the patient and the room, believing evil spirits could not tolerate their sacred scent. She would create protective amulets filled with verbena and rowan to be worn against the skin. In some traditions, she might even attempt a form of empathetic bargaining or confrontation, speaking directly to the entity she believed possessed the patient, commanding it to leave in the name of older, more primal powers than those recognized by the church. This was the precipice on which she constantly stood. Her compassionate attempts to soothe a troubled mind could be spectacularly misconstrued. The very rituals that provided a framework for healing, the chanting, the use of fumigation, the creation of protective charms, were indistinguishable from the practices of witchcraft in the eyes of an inquisitor. If her patient recovered from a bout of possession after her intervention, it was not seen as a medical success but as proof that she held authority over the demonic forces involved. The logic was perverse and inescapable. Only someone who had commanded the demon could have made it leave. Conversely, if the patient's condition worsened or they died, perhaps in a state of frenzy or self-harm, the healer was blamed for either botching a dark ritual or for having cast a malicious curse that caused the possession in the first place. Her deep, intuitive work at the fragile intersection of body and spirit made her irreplaceable to her community, but it also painted the brightest target on her back, marking her as a woman who trafficked with the very darkness she claimed to fight. Yet beyond the fears of heresy and the whispers of demonic pacts, there existed a far more earthly and calculating motivation for the persecution of these village practitioners, one rooted not in theology but in economics. The university-trained physician, with his Latin texts and his exalted social status, represented a massive financial investment. His education was long, costly, and exclusive, available only to men of means and the right social standing. Upon graduating, he entered a highly stratified medical marketplace where his authority and his fees were protected by powerful guilds and the endorsement of the church. His patients were the wealthy, the noble, and the clerical elite. His very identity was built upon a foundation of exclusivity and expense. Into this protected economy stepped the local healer, operating with no license, no formal training, and most alarmingly, no regard for the established fee structure. She represented a devastatingly effective form of competition, where a physician would charge a small fortune for a consultation, a diagnosis, and a complex prescription to be filled by a licensed apothecary. The healer would often accept payment in kind, a basket of eggs, a loaf of bread, a length of cloth, or sometimes nothing at all. Her remedies were sourced from the local woods and fields, not imported from expensive merchants. She was, in essence, providing a form of socialized medicine centuries before the concept had a name, and in doing so, she was undermining the entire economic model of official medicine. The threat was not just to the physicians' pockets, but to their very prestige. The healer's success rate, particularly with common ailments, was often comparable to, or even better than, that of the physician. While the learned doctor might be bleeding a nobleman based on the position of the stars for a humoral imbalance, the healer was applying a honey and plantain poultice to a peasant's infected wound with observable positive results. This created an intolerable situation for the medical establishment. How could they justify their exorbitant fees and their social superiority if a poor, uneducated woman could achieve similar or better outcomes with her free folk remedies? Her existence was a living rebuke to their entire system, proving that their expensive, Galenic complexities were not the only path to healing. This economic resentment provided a powerful incentive for persecution, and it often found its most vicious expression in the wake of medical failure. When a physician's wealthy patient died despite, or sometimes because of his drastic treatments of purging, bleeding, and toxic metals, the doctor faced a serious threat to his reputation and his livelihood. He needed a scapegoat, and the local healer was the perfect candidate. A narrative could easily be constructed. The patient had not died from the physician's ministrations, but because a malicious which had previously cursed them or administered a slow-acting poison. Perhaps the healer, jealous of the physician's status, had used her dark arts to undermine his cure. The accusation served multiple purposes. It protected the physician's professional standing, it channeled the family's grief and anger toward a vulnerable outsider, and it neatly eliminated a competitor from the community. The apothecaries, too, had a vested interest in the healer's downfall. Their guilds held a monopoly on the sale of medicinal ingredients, and they charged handsomely for them. A healer who bypassed their shops entirely, gathering her own herbs and compounding her own salves, was directly cutting into their profits. It was not uncommon for apothecaries to support accusations of witchcraft, secretly or openly, providing expert testimony that a healer's homemade remedy contained unnatural or forbidden ingredients. The line between legitimate business competition and a capital accusation became dangerously thin. A woman could find herself facing the stake not because her cure failed, but because it worked too well and threatened the financial ecosystem of the powerful. In the brutal economics of medieval medicine, a free and effective healer was not a blessing. She was a market disruption to be neutralized, and a charge of witchcraft was the most efficient corporate takeover strategy of the age. The path from a healer's cottage to the executioner's pyre was not a sudden plunge into mob violence, but a terrifyingly formal process, paved with laws and legitimized by courts. The legal framework for persecution was established long before any individual accusation, rooted in a series of papal decrees and secular statutes that specifically targeted unauthorized healing. The pivotal moment came in the late 12th century with Pope Alexander III, who decreed that no one could undertake medical practice without the approval of the local bishop. This effectively granted the Church a monopoly on healing, making every village healer an automatic outlaw. This was dramatically intensified in 1484 by Pope Innocent VIII's infamous bull, Summis Desiderantes Effectibus, which explicitly linked witchcraft with the obstruction of healing, empowering inquisitors to prosecute those who used charms and spells to cure disease. Secular laws quickly followed suit. In England, the Witchcraft Act of 1542 made it a capital crime to use invocations or conjurations to find treasure, provoke unlawful love, or most damningly for our healers, to attempt to cure human disease. A healer's garden was now, by legal definition, an arsenal of weapons against the state. An accusation could begin from anywhere. It often started not with a dramatic denunciation, but with a whisper from a rival, a disgruntled former patient, or a competing physician whose expensive treatments had failed. Grief was a powerful catalyst. A family who had lost a child might, in their anguish, reinterpret the healer's every action. Her compassionate touch became a malevolent marking, her herbal teas became poisons, and her failure to save a life became proof she had never intended to. The initial complaint would be brought to a local magistrate or a parish priest who was legally obligated to investigate. This investigation was not a search for truth, but a process of confirmation, a gathering of evidence that would support a preordained conclusion. The healer's own reputation was her greatest liability. Her long history of successful cures was not seen as proof of her skill, but as a catalogue of suspicious events that required a supernatural explanation. Once arrested, the healer entered a legal nightmare designed to elicit a confession above all else. The rules of evidence were grotesquely skewed against her. Spectral evidence, the testimony of a witness who claimed to have seen the healer's spirit or familiar demon at work, was often admissible. So was the discovery of a devil's mark, a spot on the skin believed to be insensate to pain where a familiar spirit would suckle. Inquisitors would methodically prick the accused woman's body with long, sharp needles until they found an area that didn't bleed or elicit a scream, which was then presented as definitive proof of her pact. But the most damning evidence was paradoxically her own medical success. This inverted logic was the core of the prosecution's case. If a healer had cured someone after prayers had failed, it was proof she had used demonic power. If she possessed a detailed knowledge of herbs, it was evidence she had been taught by the devil. Her very compassion could be used against her. Visiting a patient late at night was not seen as dedication, but as a cover for attending a witch's Sabbath. Her tools became torture instruments, her herbs became poisons, and her whispered charms became invocations to Satan. The trial itself was a spectacle of horror, with torture serving as the primary engine of justice across most of Europe. Its purpose was not to determine guilt, but to extract the confession needed to legitimize the execution. Methods were designed to break both body and spirit. The strappado, where the accused's hands were tied behind her back and she was hoisted into the air by a rope, dislocating her shoulders, was a common starting point. The rack, thumb screws, and leg screws followed, each turn of the wheel opening a new chapter in a confession scripted by the inquisitors themselves. They would lead her with questions, feeding her the details of the demonic pact they expected to hear. When did the devil appear to you? What form did he take? What did he promise you in exchange for your soul? Under such agony, the healer would confess to anything. She would admit to flying on a broomstick to a Sabbath, to poisoning neighbors, to blighting crops, fantasies that bore no relation to her life of healing, but which perfectly matched the theological fears of her tormentors. A confession, even one obtained under extreme duress, was the cornerstone of the case. A refusal to confess merely proved the devil was granting her supernatural strength to withstand the pain, which was itself evidence of her guilt. Some cases became infamous, their details meticulously recorded in trial transcripts that now serve as chilling memorials. The trial of Walpurga Horsemannin in 1587 in the German town of Dillingen is a textbook example. A midwife and healer, Walpurga was accused of a litany of witchcraft crimes. The evidence against her included her successful treatments, which were reinterpreted as magic, and the accusations of mothers whose children had died. Under torture, she confessed to using a magical salve to fly, to having sexual relations with the devil, and to killing over 40 children. She was executed by burning. In England, the Pendle witch trials of 1612 saw the conviction of old Demdike, an elderly, blind woman known for her healing charms. Her knowledge of traditional medicine and her ability to recite her recipes, her witch's prayers, were the very things that sealed her fate. She died in prison before she could be executed, but her family was not spared. These were not isolated incidents. They were the systematic application of a legal process that had weaponized the law against knowledge, compassion, and female autonomy, turning the healer's greatest virtues into the capital crimes for which she would be consumed by fire. Yet the story of these healers does not end at the stake. Their legacy, though written in ash and blood, stubbornly persisted, a subterranean river of knowledge that would eventually feed the mainstream of modern medicine. While the church and the medical establishment sought to eradicate their practices, many of their most condemned methods held a kernel of empirical truth that would be validated centuries later, proving that their greatest crime was not heresy, but being centuries ahead of their time. The persecution of these innovators did not protect society from evil. It brutally severed a vital branch of human inquiry, setting back medical progress for generations and forcing science to rediscover, in laboratories, what had once been known in cottages. Consider the vast herbal knowledge that was lost or driven underground. The witch's garden, so feared by authorities, was in fact a living laboratory of early pharmacology. We now understand the scientific basis for many of their signature remedies. The willow bark they used to reduce fever and inflammation contained salicin, the natural precursor to acetylsalicylic acid, what we know today as aspirin. The ergot fungus, associated with sinister rituals and madness, contains alkaloids that are the foundation for drugs used to treat migraines and, crucially, to induce contractions and control postpartum bleeding in modern obstetrics. The digitalis found in foxglove, a plant steeped in fairy lore and suspicion, is a powerful cardiac glycoside still used to treat heart conditions. These were not random acts of magic. They were the results of generations of careful observation, experimentation, and a deep, intuitive understanding of the natural world's chemistry. Each healer burned represented the loss of a unique, irreplaceable database of botanical knowledge, a loss that pharmaceutical science is still, in a way, trying to recapture. Their surgical courage, so often framed as desecration, paved the way for modern operative techniques. The practice of trepanning, so shocking to medieval sensibilities, is a direct antecedent to modern neurosurgery. Today, craniotomies are performed to relieve the exact same intracranial pressure that these ancient surgeons identified, using vastly superior tools but following the same fundamental principle. The early anesthetics and antiseptics they developed, however crude, were the first halting steps toward the sterile operating theaters of today. The use of honey and certain mosses in poultices to prevent infection has been validated by modern science, which recognizes their natural antibacterial properties. By condemning these practices as witchcraft, the authorities didn't just kill individuals, they suppressed entire fields of practical surgical innovation, delaying the development of pain management and infection control by centuries. Perhaps the most profound loss was in the realm of methodology. The village healer was a practical scientist. She employed a process of observation, hypothesis, and testing. She kept mental records of what worked and what didn't, adjusting her remedies based on outcomes. This empirical approach stands in stark contrast to the rigid, theory-bound Galenic medicine practiced by university physicians, which relied on ancient texts and abstract humoral theory rather than observable results. The healers were essentially practicing an early form of the scientific method, yet it was this very flexibility and willingness to adapt that made them so threatening to the established order. By systematically eliminating these empirical practitioners, the Church and state effectively enforced a medical orthodoxy that prioritized ancient authority over new evidence, drastically slowing the pace of medical discovery. It was a war on empiricism itself, and its casualties were measured in centuries of needless suffering. The great tragedy is that Western medicine was forced to reinvent the wheel. Procedures, chemical compounds, and diagnostic insights that were known to a network of women across Europe had to be painfully rediscovered in the 18th and 19th centuries by men working in officially sanctioned institutions. The journey to accept digitalis, for instance, involved the rediscovery of a folk remedy known to healers for generations. The entire field of psychopharmacology, which now uses altered states to treat mental illness, is in some ways a rediscovery of the profound psychological insights healers accessed through their psychoactive salves and rituals. We are only now, with advanced technology, beginning to catch up to the intuitive understanding these women had of the deep connection between mind and body, between our internal states and the chemical tapestry of the natural world. The burning times were not just a historical injustice, they were a catastrophic interruption in humanity's relationship with its own healing potential. A stark reminder that progress is not inevitable and that knowledge once lost is terribly difficult to regain. So the medieval healer existed in a state of impossible tension, a figure forever balancing on a knife's edge between reverence and fear. Her life was a continuous negotiation where her greatest gift, the knowledge to alleviate suffering, was also her most profound liability. She was called upon in the dead of night, her skills desperately sought to save a child or ease a difficult birth, yet that very success could be twisted into evidence of a demonic pact by morning light. She walked a tightrope woven from community need and theological suspicion, where a single misstep, a failed cure, a jealous neighbor's whisper, a priest's disapproving gaze, could send her plunging from respected community pillar to condemned heretic in a heartbeat. This paradoxical existence was rooted in the dual nature of her craft itself, a fascinating blend of what we would now separate into superstition and genuine scientific insight. Her practice was a rich, complex tapestry where threads of ancient pagan ritual were woven seamlessly with Christian prayer, where astrology informed surgery and the doctrine of signatures guided herbalism. To dismiss it all as mere superstition is to ignore the very real, observable results she often achieved. Her use of willow bark for pain, of honey for its antiseptic properties, of ergot for childbirth, these were acts of early pharmacology, born from generations of careful observation and trial and error. Yet to dismiss the spiritual and ritualistic elements as pointless is to misunderstand the medieval world entirely. In an universe where every ailment had a spiritual cause, the chant, the amulet, and the astrological timing were as crucial to the healing process as the poultice itself. They treated the patient's soul and their community's fears, which was often just as important as treating the body. The persecution they faced was rarely just about the fear of magic, it was about the fear of autonomous power. The healer's authority did not come from a university, a guild, or the church. It came from her own skill, her empirical results, and the trust of the common people. This made her a dangerous outlier in a society built on strict hierarchies. She was living proof that a woman, an outsider, could wield significant influence and command respect outside the sanctioned channels of power. Her elimination was a way to reinforce that control, to assert that healing, and by extension, hope itself, could only be dispensed by those with the proper institutional backing. This historical struggle echoes profoundly in our own time. The tension between established authority and innovative, often disruptive, medical knowledge is far from over. We see it in the long, fraught journey of alternative therapies toward mainstream acceptance, in the initial skepticism that often greets new ideas, and in the powerful economic interests that can influence what is deemed legitimate medicine. The story of the medieval healer challenges us to ask difficult questions. Who gets to decide what constitutes valid knowledge? How do we balance necessary caution with open-minded innovation? And when does the protection of established practice cross the line into the suppression of progress? Their legacy is a complicated one, written not in textbooks but in fragments of folklore, trial records, and the silent, stubborn persistence of herbal wisdom. They were not all wise women innocently persecuted, nor were they all dangerous sorceresses. They were complex individuals operating with the best understanding they had in a world fraught with danger. They remind us that the path of medical progress has never been a straight line, but a winding road paved with both brilliant insight and tragic misunderstanding. Their story is ultimately a human one, a testament to the relentless and often perilous pursuit of knowledge in the face of suffering. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Of all the forbidden practices we explored, from the mandrake scream to the flying salves, which one surprised or fascinated you the most?